The merchant magnates in London and Birmingham and a couple of other big cities now wanted to revive what had been before the revolution without all of the consequences that the monarchy brought. So they were beginning to ask for change. 10 years of virtue had been enough for them. They were disenchanted. They wanted change. Well, in 1659, the year after Cromwell's death, the man who had taken over the scene of strongman in England was George Monk. He was now in command of the army as a successor to Cromwell automatically, and Richard was only too happy to hand it over to him. And Monk was looked to by everybody as the next man. What do we do, Monk? What do we do? So he descended on London. He brought his army down into London the next year, 1650, and he dumped out all the bare-bones Parliament people. Now, they had been Cromwell's cronies. They're his men. And Monk installed a pro-royalist Parliament. There were a lot of people who wanted to back the king. So he said, I'm reading his mind as if I could, but it looks as if he felt that that was going to be the pressure and wave for the future, and to go with it would be politically appropriate. And then they began, he and the magnates, the big mercantile bosses, if you will, negotiating with the Prince of Wales, who was in exile in Holland. And they said, if you will agree to a certain list of restrictions, you are invited to come home and be king. This was the Declaration of Breda, because it was signed in Breda. Well, Charles said, of course, gentlemen, of course, whatever, where do I sign? And he immediately signed the declaration. And in the spring of the next year, 1650, Charles returned to England and was proclaimed King Charles II. Now, when he landed at Portsmouth, it looked like all of England was there to meet him. There was such a release of joy and delight that the chilly days of the commonweal were over, and all of the people who had been pushed down and pushed out of sight and had been hiding all of these years were now there in full force to greet him. Oh, it was like the second coming. They dragged his coach by hand from Portsmouth up to London. They were just, overwhelming. Nothing like it's ever been seen in England. Well, there were conditions on the monarchy, of course. First of all, he was penniless. He had been living on the dole all these years, good graces of friends, and he was totally dependent on Parliament for money. So that was one restriction. And the military control was under Parliament. Actually, it was under General Monk. So he had no control over the military. He couldn't order the army to do anything. That is the major weapon of any arbitrary government, control of the military. That's why we worry today about how arbitrary relationship has become between the executive and the military. Well, the king still had appointing powers, to be sure. He could give grants and titles and patents to people, and usually they paid for these things, so that was a little income that was coming in. And it also, you were glad to pay for it because it gave you an honor, it gave you a position at court, usually, or a title that made you somebody above everybody else. And that's, of course, what we all lust after, isn't it? The Church of England was reestablished. That was that. The Anglican Church, the C of E, the Church of England, was back. And it was imposed with the Act of Uniformity. Everybody was now under the church. That doesn't mean you all had to be an Anglican. That meant if you wanted a job or a position anywhere, you'd better be one. Maybe it was 18 months after he had been crowned, he ordered his officers, which he could do, to round up all of the members of that 40-man court that had executed his father. Well, many of them had fled, and some of them were dead. Now his officers wanted to go after everybody. A lot of his lords were still with him, but they had lost all their manor houses and their properties, all been stolen during the Commonwealth period. They wanted revenge. He wouldn't let them do it. There were always incidents, but generally speaking, the policy was, no, we're not going to have any more of that. He'd been a teenager in exile. First in France, he joined his mother there and his sister, and of course he took his brother James, and they all lived there for a while, but it became inconvenient, and so he moved alone and then with James over to Holland, where he stayed until his restoration. And he was in debt to all these people. You know, they all wanted their money back. They'd been paying out for his support, and they wanted their money back, and of course he didn't have it. Charles was a very tolerant man, by and large. Not only was he witty and funny and charming, but he was tolerant. And he tolerated everybody religiously except the Puritans. That's understandable. How could you stomach a Puritan? And of course, these Puritans made another dash for out of the country. Actually, they went to Holland first. You know that. And then they made their way across to blight the American coastline. Charles had been a survivor. He learned from the age of 11 and 12 and 13, and he'd had to flee to Scotland during the Civil War and then across. And he learned to make his way as a survivor. And to survive, you have to dissemble. You tell everybody what they want to hear. You figure out what they want to hear, and that's what you tell them. So he was a dissembler, par excellence. He also was a terrible liar. But anyway, well, his father had lied too. He did it in the goals that he had. His court life, well, here he'd been a young man, restricted and constantly drawn in his exuberance. He was a naturally outgoing man, very garrulous, full of energy, and he'd been pushed down. Well, now it was all let out. And his court was the bawdiest court imaginable. And he had all these mistresses. There were at one time 7 mistresses living in the palace with him. He couldn't say no.